heard this phrase recently from you.
Yes.
On the Senate floor and elsewhere, this writ of assistance. What is a writ of assistance?
A writ of assistance basically is, imagine a warrant, a court order that just says, we hereby give Officer X, Y, and Z the power to go and find evidence of unlawful activity. Make it so. That's fundamentally incompatible with what we now have as a protection in the form of the Fourth Amendment that requires particularity in a warrant and requires that any warrant be issued by a judge on the basis of probable cause of criminal activity. And without that combination of things, the evidence establishing probable cause and particularity, a judicial order with a warrant, you shouldn't be able to go in and search someone's home. Well, back during the late revolutionary period, in other words, the period of time leading up to the American Revolution, British officers were doing this left and right with writs of assistance, even though it was prohibited under English law, even though there were rights established that guaranteed Englishmen, including those residing in America, the degree of privacy necessary to protect against this. James Otis spoke out against this, and he litigated against it. And he was an early advocate for the principles that are now embodied in the Fourth Amendment. It's particularly relevant today as we see the federal government, the NSA, acting through, among other things, Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, purporting to have the authority to go out and collect data, including the substance of conversations, as long as they involve a person who is deemed an agent of a foreign power. They can go in and record conversations and then go back through and search the database, including those recordings.
Which is what we've been hearing about lately.
Yes, even if they are U.S. citizens who have themselves done nothing to arouse suspicion. So that's why this is still relevant today. That's why the story that I tell of James Otis still matters today. Later this year, we're going to be asked to revise and reauthorize Section 702 of the FISA Act. It's one of the reasons why I've got grave concerns with it. When people read the story of James Otis, they'll see why.
The story of James Otis. Also, the story of Susan Rice. And the story that we've been reading more and more and more of the so-called, and that's what you're talking about, incidental collection of information. The revelation or unmasking of American citizens who've done nothing because they haven't been charged with anything. Putting their names in reports, having recorded them, transcribed them, unmasking them, putting the names in reports. And a recent Circa analysis said that this past year, 2016, tripled the number of occasions in which that sort of thing happened from the prior year. And this is this Section 702. You've had some qualms about this in the past, haven't you?
I have, and I voted against it last time it came up for reauthorization. I joined together with a number of liberal Democrats on the Judiciary Committee, with Dick Durbin and Pat Leahy, with whom I disagree on many other issues, but I have agreed from the outset of my service in the United States Senate that there are problems with Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Look, we don't ever want to get back into a situation where the government possesses something similar to a writ of assistance. And we know from the Church Commission reports a few decades ago that in every presidential administration, from FDR all the way through Nixon, the intelligence gathering agencies of the federal government were used for political espionage. Meaning if they didn't like you, if they didn't like me, if they didn't like your neighbor or my neighbor or anyone else, they could go out and say, I want to take down that person. I want to get some information on that person. Even if you had done nothing wrong, they could go after you and collect information until they have what they need to embarrass you, humiliate you, or even worse, subject you to criminal prosecution. That's scary, and every American ought to be worried about that.
It looks like the House is taking steps to look into that.
Yes.
Do you know if the Senate is?
Yes.
Lindsey Graham seems to be pressing this too.
He is, and Lindsey Graham is someone with whom I've disagreed on this very issue at times in the past. But Lindsey Graham is seeing it. He's got evidence apparently suggesting that he himself was a victim of this. So he's grasping this, and we've got more people on both sides of the political aisle who are seeing this as a potential problem. Because look, when you've got a federal government that's now spending around $4 trillion a year, that imposes $2 trillion in regulatory compliance costs, that has more criminal laws on the books than we can even count. I mean, no joke. We tried to get an estimate a few years ago of how many federal criminal laws there are. We were told it's unknown and unknowable.
Yeah.
When you've got all of that coupled with unfettered discretion to look into things that are private, you've got a recipe for disaster on your hands, a recipe that could destroy liberty.
And yet, while liberal Democrats may join you in some of these things, they help build this Leviathan where it's inevitable. Isn't it odd?
Yes, and that is what happens. I mean, look, this is what big governments do. It's one of the reasons why Madison explained in the Federalist Papers that, what is government but the greatest window into human nature that exists. If men were angels, they'd have no need of government. If men could be governed by angels, they wouldn't need all these rules surrounding government. But we're not angels, and we don't have angels available to govern over us. So we need rules to make clear that those who make and enforce and interpret the rules themselves have to follow. If they do, the people benefit, and the government can continue to be something that serves the people. But to the extent we drift from that, and we have drifted significantly, the people can be made the servants of the government. We never want that to be the case. And to the extent that is now the case, we've got to reverse it. It's one of the reasons I wrote this book. When people read written out of history, they'll come to a greater understanding of how far we've drifted and what it is that we can do to change the political dialogue and bring people back to the message of liberty.
Do you think people understand the message of liberty? It seems to me liberty means different things to different people. And again, Lincoln made that point. Talked about people claiming the liberty to own slaves. And people claiming, no, that's not liberty. That's quite the opposite of liberty. But even in modern times, it seems to me a lot of people seem to think liberty is the liberty to get free stuff, so you're free to do what you want to do. And that's not liberty. And yet, I think, thanks to the left and thanks to certain politicians and so forth, people misconstrue, not most people, but enough people, a lot of people, misconstrue liberty for government benefits or government regulations or government equalizing this or government taking care of that. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're exactly right. And it's one of the reasons why some of the people discussed in this book have been written out of history, why they're forgotten today, is because their stories, their narratives are inconsistent with the modern progressive ideology, the narrative that people have been taught in public schools. It's one of the reasons why people should look to this as a homeschool curriculum or a curriculum supplementing students of every age, even people who are not formally in school. But here's the way I look at it, Mark. Rights involve the identification of something that the government can't do to you. A right is something the government cannot do to you, not something the government must provide for you. And when you flip that around and suggest that government can do anything to you it wants, and it must provide you with certain things, you flip the entire script to the point that the people really do become subservient to the government, dependent upon the government. No one wants to live in that world. Even the progressives who openly tout this stuff, if they really think about it and follow it all the way through, don't, or at least shouldn't, want to live in that world. We've seen how that movie ends. It's not pleasant. We don't want to go there. And look, the message that I have here is that none of this has to be either particularly conservative or particularly liberal. This is politically, ideologically agnostic. The point here is that the American people ought to identify limits on what the federal government can do to them. Once they identify those limits, then they can decide what kind of government they want, as long as they do it at the appropriate level and subject to the appropriate limitations.
I think a lot of people do that and a lot of people don't. In other words, but I think those of us who do it, we get frustrated. It's okay, so how does this manifest itself? You vote, and kind of stuck in the quicksand. You go to a judge, it's an Obama appointee, well, there you go. Still into campaign comments, stuff like that. So people get more and more frustrated. You understand that.
Yes.
And they don't know what to do.
They don't.
And you would tell them, be resolute, just keep pounding away, right? Pretty much. I mean, so beat the other side down rather than have them beat you down.
Yes, but even more than beating the other side down, win the other side over with the right arguments. Win the other side over by...
Let me ask you about